Today's conversation about mental health, mindfulness, spirituality, we're going to have a rich discussion. We'll have three sort of categories of questions that we'll touch on, and then turn it to you in the audience to ask questions, both live and submitted through a QR code that will be on the screen later on. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm excited. So topic number one, what is mental health? Talk about a big open question, right? And so I guess I invite each of you, how do you personally understand mental health?
How do we personally?
Yeah.
That's all you.
Oh my goodness. I had a feeling that was coming. Can you all hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, it's great to be here. Definitely excited about this conversation that you all are having, as you could hear. For my bio, this is something that's near and dear to my heart. So to be able to have this important conversation, to be able to dialogue in this place, I think is really important. So we start with the easy question. What is mental health? So I'll first talk about it in the sense by saying that I like the way the American Psychological Association, which some of you may be familiar with, centers mental health around emotional well-being. But I'm also a neuroscientist, so I tend to think about it from a brain perspective. And in that sense, oftentimes I'm thinking about, well, what happens in our brain that allows us to basically experience the things that we experience with our five senses on a day-to-day basis, and how do we respond to that? But then also, how does our emotional state or what's happening in our brain actually impact how we engage with the world? So both from an input standpoint and from an output standpoint. And it did say personal, so to personalize it a little bit, I'll just tell you about my day today even getting here. So I flew into to Boston this morning and then rented a car to get up here. The transition, the flight was pretty smooth overall getting to Boston. Then things got a little bit interesting. So for what, first of all, we were talking about, I think, directions at the airport. I didn't know if it was just me, but I couldn't find signs anywhere for like, where do I go? Where's the rental car? People are nodding. That makes me feel better.
Yeah.
So I had to ask a bunch of people. Then I found the bus, and I was like, I can't tell when I'm supposed to get off the bus because there's no sign saying, so I had to ask the guy next to me. So all that's happening. I finally found the rental spot. I'm like, okay, good. This is good. So only two people in line in front of me. The couple in front of me was at the service desk for like a half hour. I was like,
it's a bad sign.
What is happening here? Something's not getting situated. Okay, first thing. So eventually I got there, I got through the line. I got my car, went down up, then I forgot because I've been waiting so long where I was supposed to look for the car. Found the car eventually, got in the car, and I was like, okay, I need directions to be able to drive up to Dartmouth. So let me just connect my Bluetooth to the car. That wouldn't work. Small thing, but other things you can do. Then I noticed that my phone battery was getting a little bit low, so I was like, well, let me plug in my phone so I can charge it. My phone didn't connect with the adapter that they had in the car. Then this is a rental car, so this isn't a car that I'm very familiar with driving. It was raining, which shouldn't be surprising, but it was raining. So I got in the car, everything was frosting over. I was heading towards one of the Boston tunnels. And so as I'm trying to figure out where the defrost is, and I'm scraping things down with my hand, and I hear a little bump as I was scraping the side of the tunnel in a rental car. So I'm going to leave that all there. But as you can see,
I hope that Dartmouth bought the insurance on the car for you. So
we'll come back to that. But with each of those scenarios, you can see that I had lots of different options for how I was going to respond to each situation. I had a mixture of internal responses. There was some frustration to the people that were just couldn't figure out what they were doing for a half hour. There was a little bit of panic when I heard that scraping sound. I did check it. There was no damage. I think it was just a tire rubbing. But you can see how I had responses to each of those. Now, my internal state would also impact how if I hadn't slept in 5 days, I'd have a very different response to each of those situations. Also, let's say I'm someone who really struggles with anxiety. All the uncertainty that showed up in each of those scenarios would also have impacted how I responded. Or if I was someone who's navigating through depression, maybe I wouldn't even have felt like getting out of bed or getting on the plane or coming here. So I say all that to say that you can see both of those pieces happening together. There are things that happen in our environment that affect us, but it's also how we feel about ourselves and our brain states, our emotional state, our emotional well-being that can impact how we interact with the things around us. So a unique way of answering the question.
No, I think that's right on. Stories are important. The question to you.
Okay.
You tried to dodge it. You tried to dodge it and pass it off, but
I drove up from Boston last night. There's no scraping. They're not alone. The signs at Boston Logan are maybe the worst in the world. If you can find a sign at all. When I think about mental health, I often think of something when I was in Japan that my mentor often said, and I will read it right. He says, "Don't confuse good health with not being sick. A truly healthy life is one spent creating value, tackling the challenges thrown at us over a lifetime, striving to achieve something worthy and meaningful, and constantly expanding the frontiers of our life." Right? My mentor often says that. So when I think about mental health, then I often think about a kind of life condition that is flexible, right? Which is to say that I think about it like a surfer, right? I primarily live in California. And and some of my students here, some of you have heard this before, right? I cannot swim well. If I was thrown into the pool, I could probably survive. The ocean, maybe not. But because of that, when I see a 20-foot wall of water coming at me, I am not happy, to say the least. I am quite afraid. Right? But a surfer, right, looks at that 20-foot wall of water and says, "This is what I've been waiting for, right? I'm ready for this. This is what I trained for," right? So when I think of mental health, then I think of mental health in that way, which is to say, to have a kind of flexibility, right? A kind of empowerment that allows for the inevitable, right? Which is problems, right? That problems will come. So that's often what comes to my mind.
Yeah.
when I think
I love that. I love the perspective shifts that you both brought to this based on where you're at the moment. And I wonder, given your backgrounds, how does your religious or spiritual foundations impact the way that you approach or thinking about mental health?
Well, I am Buddhist, and I have been for about 25 years. And since the title of this whole thing being about mindfulness.
Right on the nose, yeah.
And mindfulness, of course, as a concept largely comes out of Buddhist traditions, I would say that it directly influences how I think about these things. Right? But I'm often concerned, and we talked about this when we were discussing over Zoom, I'm often concerned about the way in which mindfulness is excerpted from Buddhist traditions, right? The way in which mindfulness is appropriated from its context, and I'm sure we'll get to that. Yeah.
Any thoughts on how your religious and spiritual background contribute to your understanding of mental health?
Yeah, I would say in multiple ways. So I already alluded to my, vocation as a neuroscientist and how that shapes how I think about a lot of things. But I would also say from thinking about mental health, not just from a brain perspective, but holistically, I also think about the fact that I believe in a God that created human beings. And so that includes our body and our brain. And so I think about that kind of as an overarching theme for how I think about mental health in general. But then also thinking about the fact that I believe in a God that cares about our mental health and has given us lots of different tools and ways to be able to address our mental health. So I think about it from a very holistic standpoint, both from the standpoint of who the creator is, but then also from the tools that he's given us to be able to address those things. And there's more pieces to that, which I'm sure will come up later in the conversation. I'll leave that as a teaser.
All right. Well, we'll just plant that and let it germinate a little bit. So outside of your professional and scholarly work, your academic work, your spiritual, what are the other areas in your life that contribute to the way that you think about mental health and the way that you approach it, both for yourself and the people around you?
So I'll say there's nothing that's off limits in that sense.
Okay.
So I think about the faith components. I think about aspects from the field of psychiatry. I think about things from psychology. I think about things from sociology and culture. I think about things like the social determinants of health, depending on where people live and how that impacts their mental health. So really all of those things together, and I find it very problematic to try and look at it from one lens only, because so many different times and so many different situations, I've seen problems with that arise. Speaking at an event like this, probably about 10 years ago, hearing from a student who is studying neuroscience and saying she didn't know how to help her aunt who was struggling with both anxiety and depression. Because her aunt was being told the only reason she wasn't getting better is because she wasn't praying hard enough. And so this is a person, the student, who also had a faith background, but felt like her aunt was stuck because she couldn't help her navigate through. But then also being in situations where I'm teaching the medical students and hearing students say, oh, this information you're giving us is all really helpful, helping us learn about the brain and what things happen during relapse. But what are we supposed to do with those people that think that a higher power can help them through their addiction, their mental health challenges?
Yeah.
So frustrations on both sides, and seeing how that limited perspective, one size fits all, can be so detrimental and damaging. So that's probably shaped my perception of always wanting to make sure that I think about things holistically and not dismiss anything at the onset without really understanding.
Rather than just relinquishing that something else is, it's all coming together. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think from the same perspective, right, this holistic perspective of bringing to the table, right, what health means and mental health means in my own family, right, for good and for ill, what health means in my own religious community, like the Buddhist community that I'm a part of, but also in the scholarly community, right, the academic world from which I come, where I don't know how many of you know about PhD programs, but they are not known for their
Very supportive mental health environments, right? Sure.
They are not known for being conducive to mental health, right? They do not have to be non-conducive, but they often cannot be. So I also come at it from the perspective of thinking about what health means in the traditions that I study, to the communities that I work with, but also in the communities that I'm a part of. Right? So I think, much as you were saying, no one definition comes from one segment, right? It has to be, in a sense, triangulated from these different communities.
Absolutely. And that's, talking about PhD programs and the stressors in our high stress environments for our students, for our faculty and staff, in these elite institutions that we live and work and learn. What are some observations that you've made, or maybe misperceptions that our community might have about mental health and for our students? And I'm thinking, for me, I'm a student affairs practitioner. I've worked with students for 20 years and watched the ways in which I hear students and faculty talk about mental health. It's changed drastically, and I think we're still, we're all talking about it. We're all really grappling with it. I wonder, in your own communities of practice in higher ed, what are you seeing, what are you observing, and what are you concerned about? Just a small question.
One thing amongst students, and you were saying earlier that also amongst faculty, I won't speak for my colleagues, but I will say that amongst students, I often see an unwillingness to be wrong, and they are not wrong to be unwilling to be wrong, because they're also often in a context where the perceived consequences, or sometimes the very real social consequences of being wrong, can be quite serious. Right?
Yeah.
The social isolation that can come from being wrong, and being called out for being wrong, and all of these kinds of things. So I see that play out in classrooms, right? A general unwillingness to answer questions. Right? I frequently get told by students, if we are discussing some kind of content, and then they would say, well, I didn't say anything because I don't know anything about that content. And I would say, that is the point of a class.
Exactly, that's why you're here.
That's what we are engaged in. So I think that situation that plays out in the classroom also then plays out, I think, for many students in their lives, from what I hear about what goes on in spaces around campus.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as I was listening to the question, I was also thinking about it in terms of the mental health context as well. So misperceptions that it's easy for many of us to slip into. I think some of the misperceptions I see are actually on opposite ends of the spectrum. So in some cases, I see students and faculty and just peers in general, we don't like to admit that we have limits. So we kind of go 1,000 miles.
Ivy League? No.
Going 1,000 miles an hour and feeling like we can't stop. Sometimes for good reason. Especially in the middle of the pandemic with all the social justice challenges that were going on.
Yeah.
There were still many students that were basically trying to put out every fire that they saw and engage in, but then were just spreading themselves too thin, then getting burnt out or exacerbating mental health challenges and not being able to do anything to help others, or to even be able to have good self-care or their own balance of care. But then on the other side, I also see sometimes not enough, I have to say this carefully, not enough willingness to push through things. So sometimes, as we've talked about having more mental health awareness, we've become a little bit too loose with how we use the words like depression. Like, so many of us will be like, I'm depressed. Not to say that we're not going through something difficult, but that's very different from someone who has clinical depression or major depressive disorder. And then to put it all in one category sometimes can be an unintentional disservice to people who are really struggling and really have severe depression. And so it's both of those can come up sometimes in the same individual at different times. And so that's one thing that I think we're still learning how to have the right balance. And it's almost like we're swinging back and forth and trying to figure out what's the actual healthy place to be.
It is really challenging because the more comfortable that we get talking about just mental health in general, which is important, and we should be talking about it, we should be able to voice it, there's a desire to label it. And sometimes that label, I think, has a disservice. It was a recent study that, we're adolescents, 11 to 14, are reporting these high rates of anxiety and depression, when really they're just using that language when they're feeling anxious or feeling sad or feeling disconnected. And so it's you have to think about, as the pendulum swings, how do we calibrate that as institutions, as teachers and learners?
Yeah. One thing to add there, if I could, just because I think that's a really important point. Sometimes it's good to feel anxious. And so it's too easy for us to feel like anxiety is a bad thing. Like if I was late for my flight and I wasn't anxious and I just kind of took my time, was like, well, I'll get there when I get there. I probably wouldn't be sitting here right now. So sometimes there's a purpose. So I think, like you said, it's important to have that balance.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think very much to that point, right? The seepage of language from one domain to another, right? So when you brought up, right, the clinical definition of being depressed, right, versus the seepage of that language into everyday conversation to label any kind of general down as depression, right? Or when we talk about Buddhist tradition, then the kind of language that underlies mindfulness and how the majority of that discursive field gets dropped in favor of the language, right? So this causes a kind of, it can be positive, right? It can broaden our discussions, it can inform our discussions, but it can also, right, these terms can be blurred as they slip into domains that they weren't originally developed to apply to.
Yeah.
And as you said about anxiety and all these things, right, from many Buddhist perspectives that are centered on understandings of karma and laws of cause and effect, right, if you started a chain of causes that led to being late for your flight, and then you say, well, it couldn't be helped. What can I do? It's like, but it could have been helped. There are things you could have done. There's a chain of causality that has led to the effect you see. Some of you who have been in my class this quarter might remember when I talked about final assignments and how, right, that anxiety that comes at the end of the quarter, though you knew the quarter was ending, right, you always knew it.
Time marches on.
You always knew that paper was going to be due or whatever the thing is. Right, so that's, of course, it's not about blame, but it is to say that there are causes and effects that lead to the outcomes that you see.
Yeah, absolutely. So great segue talking about the seepage of language. Back to the conversation around mindfulness. And I wonder if you would speak a little bit more about your understanding and concept of what mindfulness means. And I think, as you alluded to in the first section, how that's come out of Buddhism in a way that is maybe unexpected, maybe it is expected.
Well, mindfulness, okay, I promise not to go on a deep historical tour.
The floor is yours. I mean,
right, that the idea of mindfulness comes out of the encounter in something called Buddhist modernism that happens in the late 19th century and early 20th century with Christian missionaries primarily in Southeast Asia, although also in Sri Lanka as well. And so what undergirds the term mindfulness in a Buddhist context, primarily in a Pali or Sanskritic context, are actually two different activities, right? To constantly keep something in mind, and that is in Sanskrit called smriti, to remember something, and to also monitor, right, how you feel, how you experience something, what you're doing. That's called samprajanya. So these two different words have gotten collapsed into the kind of English translation of smriti as mindfulness.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And then the practice kind of got secularized and flattened to be what it is, how it's often thought of today.
That's very helpful. I had no idea. When as a Buddhist practitioner and scholar, when you hear mindfulness being used in the secularized way, how do you feel about that? You might have feelings. Or I guess maybe just to make it more positive, what are some reflections or advice you might have around that?
Yes, that is a good way of putting it, right? So how I feel about it is I often start listening closely to try to discern what exactly a person means, right, when they say mindfulness. I hear that there's a mindfulness group happening on a campus somewhere, right, as is happening at many universities. My first question is always, well, what do y'all do? And what are you talking about? Right, just a curiosity.
Yeah, tell me more.
What's going on there. The things that I would caution, to keep in mind, is to remember that nothing that appears before us, right, from this building to a classroom to us sitting here right now, it doesn't happen by accident, right? There is a discursive history. There is a chain that leads to where we are. So if someone's going to engage in mindfulness, it might be helpful to do a little Googling. Right? Maybe talk to a professor, maybe talk to someone, and just find out what the history is for what it is that you were doing. And that can't help but enrich what it is you're doing.
Great. Nii, what are your thoughts on mindfulness?
Well, I'm glad you started, because if you weren't, I was going to have you start. I thought that was a little role reversal from where we started with the mental health question. So I would say my thoughts, just full disclosure, have been very much informed by experiences in psychological spaces. So it's very helpful to have that context, because even as we were talking, I already know that those introductions were devoid of the history. So from that standpoint, and just to give context as well, so I trained in neuroscience. So a lot of the work that we do is what we call basic science, just trying to understand the basic neurobiology, what's happening in the brain with things like anxiety, depression, and addiction from a research standpoint. So a lot of that can get very granular, looking at specific proteins in the brain, looking at different activity of different types of cells. And if you ever talk to a neuroscientist, you know they can be speaking another language, and you often have to kind of bring them back to the not that that's not the real world, but the real world where others can actually understand what's being said. So I say all that to say that when I was actually spending time on sabbatical, I was spending time with clinical psychologists to actually get more of an understanding of clinical interventions. And so it came up in that context, as this is a clinical intervention that people have started to incorporate mindfulness with different types of clinical interventions, things like cognitive behavioral therapy. There's also mindfulness, let me see if I remember the acronym correctly, but basically mindfulness supported types of interventions, or mindfulness informed. And so from that context, I heard basically, for lack of a better word, the stripped down version of what you mentioned, that thinking mindfully about your surroundings and not punishing yourself or being down on yourself or judging yourself if other thoughts come into play. And that was basically how those practical sessions were done in that clinical psychology space. So to be honest, usually when I'm talking about mindfulness in different settings, I'm actually not going into much of a definition of it. Whether that's good or bad is something I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, but more so kind of thinking about it in this holistic sense. Like, how can we pull in lots of different tools without dismissing any of them? So I'd say that was my introduction to it, and I've had people who've asked specific questions about it, but usually I've tried to reference them to other places as not something that I would say I have full expertise or full understanding, although that as an academic can sometimes be a cop-out, because many of us are like, I didn't study that for 5 or 10 years, so I can't speak on that. That's another topic of conversation. But then also just being, sorry for this play, mindful of the fact that we still have to be aware of where others have done more scholarly work or have more understanding for different reasons.
Yeah. From a clinical perspective, do you find that mindfulness is useful in mental health interventions?
So from what I've seen, so a lot of the work will be, people will actually do research and look at different interventions and compare them. And from what I've just looked at, it seems like the mindfulness-informed approaches can be helpful. Sometimes they're similar to what are seen with others, and sometimes they're worse. But again, it kind of all depends on what's being addressed. So there's some evidence that can be helpful with aspects of stress and stress management. Some evidence where it can be helpful when people are going through periods of depression, sometimes with addiction, but it seems to be very mixed.
I see.
But I mean, from a scientific standpoint, many of the things that we look at are very mixed.
Right.
And
Try
people
all the
have,
things.
Yep. People also people have done research on the effect of prayer and actually seen same things there, positive effects, no effects, lack of effects. So from that standpoint, it does seem to be helpful in the ways that other things are helpful, but there's still, I think this actually goes back to a point you made. It's unlikely that all those studies are doing the same thing. And so the real question probably is, what's the history, as you mentioned, and how is that actually being used in this specific situation, and what is it being used for?
Yeah.
So I feel like I dodged the question, but okay, good.
I mean, these are heady topics, and I think when we're both of your perspectives as a practitioner, as a scholar, as a from your scientific clinical, is mindfulness a form of prayer? When you're talking about the study just now that that studies about prayer in terms of your mental health and mindfulness, like, are we not saying the same thing in many ways?
I mean, that's back to what we're talking about, right? It might surprise people to know, right, that there is no one term in Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan, or Chinese, right, the kind of classical languages of Buddhist studies and Buddhist traditions. There's no one word that corresponds to many of the concepts we're talking about.
Sure.
Right? Which is why it's helpful to know how things are appropriate. Right? In most Buddhist contexts, the word that applies to practice is called bhavana, which means to be, become, or cultivate, or train. Right? So all practices would fall under that. So forms of prayer, forms of silent introspective meditation, forms of visualization, forms of contemplation, and so on and so forth, all would fall under right, notions around the cultivation right, of oneself. And so I think sometimes we are talking about the same thing, right? Sometimes we're not.
Right.
So in these studies, right, what is the distinction made in a study between prayer and meditation, quote unquote, whatever that may be?
Yeah. Getting into the semantics of it, the next question is a very big question, and I wonder how you are going to approach this, because good luck. So thinking about what is the mind? We talk about mindfulness. What is the mind, and how is that related to the brain? Is there a connection? Feels like this is you.
I'll try. I'll start. I'm going to try and broaden it a little bit too.
All right.
So this feels like a very philosophical question. So I'm not necessarily going to answer it from a philosophical perspective, but I'll go back to kind of my holistic understanding of the brain. So going back historically, I think people have defined the mind in different ways over time. When we talk about the brain, that's a little bit more centralized because that's an organ that we can focus on. But I will say that I think we're having a more realistic view of the brain not being this separate entity that somehow, this is going to sound ridiculous, but that's somehow not a part of our body. The reason I say that is because I think sometimes when we've talked about mental health, we act as if the brain isn't part of our body. Because I overuse this example, and I apologize ahead of time. My kids aren't here, so they won't get mad at me. But if I had a heart attack, someone would probably call an ambulance, and I'd get taken to the hospital. If I needed to have a surgery, I'd have a surgery. No one would tell me you had a heart attack, get over it.
Yeah. Can't you why don't you go outside and see if that helps?
But when there's something that's happening with our brain regarding mental health, we often do that without even thinking about it. Even with ourselves. I wish I could just get over this thing. Or I wish the person could just, do X, Y, and Z. So we're acting as if the brain doesn't have effects on our body the same way the heart does. But it does in a lot of different ways. And so coming back to this whole idea of the mind and the brain, I would say that as a field and as a society, we're also realizing how much our brain is integrated with so many aspects of our day-to-day lives. So I touched a little bit on some of the health disparities. So people who are growing up in places that are devoid of nature and don't have gardening spaces, all those things actually have impacts on our brains and can make it more likely we'll have certain mental health challenges, just as one example. But then there's so many other things for people who are thinking about things like nutrition. There's a whole field of neuroscience that's now looking at the gut-brain connection. And people are talking about things like the microbiome in our gut and how that can actually impact our brains. Even when people are going through challenges like depression, there's certain immunological responses that people can have that can actually make it more likely they'll have depression. That can also be influenced by people's diet. So that's just one example. And I say that to say that just shows us, as we all obviously know, our brain is connected to the rest of our body, but there are different ways that the things that we do with the rest of our body can also impact our brain. And so I still haven't answered the question exactly, but from the mind perspective, I think we're getting better at thinking about our brain and our mind in terms of our entire being.
Yes.
and how connected everything is. Not that this brain is its own structure that's kind of sitting there aloof, just directing the rest of the body, and then just touch down at other times, and then it's up to us to just kind of get over things. So I'll just put it in that context to say that I think it's a bigger conversation, and scientifically we're starting to get a better sense of how much the body is integrated, including the brain.
That's great to hear that the science is following that as well, rather than people talking about the brain-body connection, and because you can't just swap it out. It's not like you have a tire that you're changing. It's really, all of these things are connected and connected to your environment as well, and that will help us understand health disparities. All sorts of important things there. Did you have any thoughts on the brain versus mind?
Yes, that in most of the traditions that I studied, right, the mind, there are models of mind, right? There are different ways of understanding how the mind works. And the most prevalent across most Buddhist traditions is that the mind has essentially 8 layers to it, right? So that there is a layer of the senses, right, kind of sensory input. And for most Buddhist traditions, the mind is also a sense, right? So Buddhists don't understand there to be 5 senses, they understand 6, right? And then there is a layer of self that is a layer of mind that is largely afflicted, that is the site of ego, right? That would be the 7th layer. And then the 8th layer is where you have all of these habits and impulses that come from both within yourself and also from your environment, right? So there is a collective dimension to mind for most Buddhist traditions, and there is an individual dimension to mind. So any attempt then to understand the mind or to understand how one's being operates for most Buddhist traditions involve attention to both the collective, right? So that would be things like your environment, the world around you, the nature around you, the people around you, and so on and so forth. And also those impulses which come from within oneself, right? And that's going to be in that 8th layer of consciousness. So I think it's always important to note the way different cultures, right, religio-social cultures, have different models of mind. And if you have a different model of mind, you are by definition going to have a differing understanding of what mental health would constitute.
That's fascinating. I had no idea. Thank you.
It's interesting to hear you talk about that too, because again, my neuroscience-centric view of the world, which is over the top sometimes, like as we were going through each of these layers, I was just thinking about the research that has been coming out, talking about the role of the brain in each of those pieces, whether the communal or the internal, and all those aspects together. So,
100%.
yeah.
So bringing us a little bit back to where we started with trying to get out of the airport, thinking about a little personal question, do you practice mindfulness, and how do you think that bears on your personal mental health?
Now you have to go first. You can't.
I do, but not in a form that would likely be recognizable to many of the people in this room, right? Depending on how you understand mindfulness, right? Because remember, mindfulness is, for most Buddhist traditions, it is a quality of mind premised on 2 different activities, right? Premised on remembering things and premised on monitoring a certain set of processes, right? So in my own practice, this consists of when I'm engaging in recitative practices, right, chanting practices, I am reviewing a set of teachings and ideas, right? And then monitoring where I am in relation to those ideas. And it is in fact the same way students once asked, this was in the fall, so if anybody was in my fall class, cover your ears. But students once asked, right, if I would teach mindfulness in the classroom, right, which I fundamentally don't do. However, I told them that we had actually already done that. Because when we went over the syllabus, right, I said what the point of the class was, right, what the principles that the class operate by, all of these things. And throughout the quarter, the students should return to the syllabus, right? So remembering what the point of the class is, that would be smriti in Buddhism. That's the practice, literally the practice of mindfulness, right? Remembering what it is you're doing, why you're doing it. And then to remember, right, for the students, that you're not robots, right? There will be times when you don't feel like doing the reading. I mean, or whatever you have to do, watching the video, going to the lab. That is inevitable. And to expect otherwise is silly. Just like newsflash, your professor doesn't always want to read your discussion. There are other things that seem appealing, right? All of these things. So to note that fact, right? To monitor that fact in oneself, to acknowledge how you feel before you go forward, that is a part of how Buddhist traditions understand mindfulness, right? So when you know what you're talking about, you're actually doing it all the time.
I love the idea of the syllabus as mindfulness practice. I think that we should spread that throughout the rest of our faculty and see how that goes. How about you? Do you practice any form of intentional or unintentional mindfulness?
Perhaps unintentional. I'll let him be the judge of that for me. But I would say one thing that I try to do actively is a term known as metacognition, which is basically thinking about your thinking. So even in the story that you heard me share this morning, obviously you could tell that I was noticing how I was responding in each situation. So basically thinking about how I'm approaching a situation and then sometimes trying to adjust that to how I'm approaching it in a certain instance or not adjust. So I even talked about the anxiety. Like there's certain times in front of certain groups where I'll feel that anxiety coming up more and more. And I've started to pay better attention to it. And that's not to say that I try to make it go away, but almost to say, okay, I know this is there. Especially you talked about some of the roles I have within diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a moving conversation in the country. And so there are a lot of spaces where I step into now where I can feel all that anxiety rising up. I realize it, I acknowledge it, and sometimes I even verbalize it to the group and then try to move through it. So that would be a practice of metacognition, as opposed to just letting it happen to me and then wondering afterwards, whoa, why did I feel so off? So it's almost a way of just kind of empowering myself to be able to move through that. And sometimes also empowering others in the room who are feeling the same thing, because that also can create an atmosphere of empathy for all of us who are experiencing the same thing in different ways.
I always think about the metacognition element when doing DEI work. I think especially as a white person doing anti-racist work, you have to notice, why am I thinking a certain way? What assumptions am I making? And how can I actively unlearn those? And naming it, I think, as a facilitator for me, is a way to normalize that anxiety, normalize the intrusive thoughts, for lack of a better word, and be able to work through it. Because if we just push it down or set it aside, we're not going to confront it and begin to understand how we arrived at these particular assumptions. So,
I mean, this is something when we talk about these kinds of practices, and yes, metacognition would count.
Okay.
That's when we talk about these kinds of practices, we're not talking about forms of suppression. And I think that's very important. It is not that you notice that you have anxiety and you try to pretend otherwise, or if you breathe some magical number of times, that you will no longer feel anxious, right? That is not the point of these practices, either in their Buddhist context or in their secular context, right? The point is to get to where you're saying, right? To be able to reflect, to be able to pause, to know that there are times when that, profound sadness or anxiety, or whatever the case may be, there are times when that is necessary, right? There are times, and there are times when it's not going to serve you well, right? And there are ways to then shift it, right? These kinds of things. So it's always important to be aware of the tendency to use these kinds of practices to avoid one's circumstances. That's generally not going to go well. I think my neuroscientist posse would agree, but it's generally not going to work out very well.
So that's an interesting transition to a topic that we've really touched on throughout our conversation, which is the impact of thinking about mindfulness in the context of mental health. And I guess just to start, when you're thinking about those using mindfulness as an avoidance technique, have you seen circumstances where that has occurred? Is it maybe a story or an anecdote when maybe that was happening, and then if there was a redirection or a correction that you can think about?
Story or an anecdote?
Or it doesn't have to be. We can just, pontificate about it. But I'm wondering, we've all been on campuses for quite some time, and I think sometimes, as you've talked about, let's focus on this mindfulness as a way to step aside from the other bigger things that are happening. And does that become problematic, or is that a means to an end? Like, is that the first step in maybe getting folks more comfortable talking about mindfulness and or mental health?
This is not really a story about mindfulness. It's a story about the self and how one understands notions of self, right? And any of you who've taken a course on Buddhism or heard something about Buddhism knows that a basic principle of Buddhism is that there is no self, right? That as self as broadly understood. And so once this was in, I think it was around 1982 or 1983, around the time the Mind Life Institute was founded to study these kinds of questions. The Dalai Lama, who at that point was still fairly new to the kinds of discourses that happen in the United States and Western Europe, and he was kind of traveling around, and so there was this big group, and the Dalai Lama told us this. I was with the Dalai Lama in DC in 2011, and he was kind of retelling his story about how he had developed since then, right? So there were students present, the scholars present, there was other scientists present, and a number of psychiatrists and psychologists were present. And they asked about this question of the self and how destabilizing that could be. And they started naming various kind of mental health challenges and various disorders that, are often thought to kind of center around notions of the self, right? So personal senses of anxiety, all of these things. And the Dalai Lama said quite seriously, funny to his translators because they were like, they knew what he was talking about. But he was being quite serious, and he said, well, there is no self. So all of these problems kind of disappear. And so, that's the good news, right? That you feel all this anxiety. You feel that you personally have all of these anxieties, and there is no you personally. So, no problem. And of course, they were completely talking past each other.
Yeah.
And of course, the alarmed psychiatrists in the room were like, no. And so the Dalai Lama then doubled down on what he was saying, right? He was like, no, y'all don't understand. And right, they're talking about fundamentally different things.
Right.
When we get to what the claim in Buddhist traditions about there being no self actually means, right, that there is no permanent, unchanging core to oneself, and that the self then is inherently flexible and changeable. That means that in Buddhist traditions, mindfulness often becomes a tool for the transformation of the self, right? Because the self can change. So the things that make one anxious over here can change, and they can move to things that don't make us anxious. The kinds of conversations that we would have that lead to discomfort, right, through dialogue, through continued interaction, it may be the case that you move to a level of comfort, right? So discomfort and comfort are moving targets. They are not solid. And that's what it means for there to be no self, right? It means that everything moves, everything changes, right? There's this constant flux. So when it comes to then conversations that happen on campuses, I do often see people talking past each other in ways that they don't realize that they're talking past each other. Or to say that something made someone uncomfortable, stop. Right? Then,
Every day.
No, then you go no further, right? But are there ways to become curious about this? Are there ways to keep going toward a place of comfort? Right? These are open questions and they're moving targets for each person. But I think that has to become a principle of interaction. I think we were talking before this that I think we would all agree that something socially, right, in society has gone askew, right, in the fundamental inability to have conversation. So in the effort to move back towards that, I think we first have to decide whether as a society we want to move to that kind of place.
Yeah. Well, so on that note, and talking about dialogue, what is the role, is there a role for mindfulness and mental health in engaging in dialogue? What I've observed in my time working with students and on campus, as you said, people are talking past each other, right? That there is no, there's no remembering and monitoring of oneself in that conversation because we're just trying to be right and we're trying to shout from the rooftops. And concurrently, also cannot actually manage through some of those conflicts. And so is there a role for mindfulness practices when we're thinking about engaging in authentic dialogue?
Can I loop back
Yeah.
to just comment and then go back to that.
Yeah.
That's like a dialogue faux pas, but.
No. Dialogue, it's, what is dialogue, right?
But as you were talking, I guess I was also thinking about, you were asking about stories and anecdotes, and there's a phrase that psychologists often use, which is to avoid avoidance. And so I was thinking about that both in terms of the societal framework that you just painted that picture of, hearing that someone disagrees and then stopping, but then also thinking about that from a personal standpoint, which might in some ways conflict, but some ways be in line with this idea that you talked about within Buddhist tradition of the self not being, I'm going to say the words wrong, but not being present in that way. But first, the sociological piece. So I think there's a danger to what you just painted, that picture of just sensing that something is in discord and then not moving past that. And then again, going back to my neuroscience, which is always my default, there's so much that we can think about from that and know from a personal, like an individual's personal experience that can get hardwired in a sense into our brains. So, okay, I'm pulling in way too many topics at once, but about 2 weeks ago, I was actually participating in a conference in New Jersey that was headed by the former governor called New Jersey Reentry Society. And this is basically for incarcerated individuals who are then coming back into society. For a lot of those people, actually had their first mental health treatments in jail because the services aren't available as they should be. That's a whole nother commentary. But what he specifically asked me about was what happens when there's a situation involving a mental health crisis where the police are called and not the mental health provider. So then you have a situation where that person who is struggling for whatever host of reasons then has an interaction with the police and has a very strident interaction when they actually need help. And they then begin to learn that pattern, that when I see authority figures, I act this way, which makes the problem worse when that person needs to be helped. And that can change the wiring in that person's brain to basically be conditioned and respond that way each time. So that's one example, but that we can also have that in our day-to-day interactions. There's something that makes us uncomfortable. Let's say every time I go to the airport, I stand in that line, and it's always gonna be long. I'm not gonna ever go back to the airport again. I rehearse that in my mind over and over and over again. I strengthen those connections and have the expectation that anytime I go to the airport, I'm gonna have that same experience. So we can have that in our day-to-day interactions. We can have that in interactions with other people. Every time I talk to a person like that, they always respond this way. And then we learn, whether that's real learning is based on fact or not, we learn that and we get stuck in that pattern. So I don't know if I lost track of the point, but I was just thinking, hopefully others are with me as well, but just thinking about the way that you put that in that context, how important it is for us to sometimes be able to get past that, to basically have new wiring in our brain so we can learn something different. And that's something that happens in therapy a lot as well. And this, again, might now contrast with the Buddhist philosophy of basically, how are you thinking about yourself in this situation? Is that based on reality? Or is that based on something that's not reality, but that you've come to believe is reality? And can you deconstruct that to actually get to a better place where you can actually move forward into situations?
It also makes me think about when we talk about social justice and the figures that have been left out of conversations around social justice, right, historically. And there are many reasons for that, right? There are no simple reasons for this. But there is a line of thinkers who come through the U.S. civil rights movement that are typically unknown. One of them, Howard Thurman, right? Another of them, Rosemary Freeman Harding. Right? She was a social justice activist. She was also a womanist theologian and scholar. And they both believed and imparted to the civil rights movement, to other leaders of the civil rights movement, namely Martin Luther King Jr., who was directly mentored in many ways by Howard Thurman, right? They imparted to the movement the idea that to be active in society also requires self-reflection, right? Sustained, intensive self-reflection, right? For Howard Thurman, that meant prayer and, scriptural reflection and all these kinds of things. For Rosemary Freeman Harding, she had a range of religious views and settled towards the end of her life on Tibetan Buddhism, right? So she drew much of her thinking from Tibetan Buddhist traditions on this. But the idea that to change, right, to make change in society requires a corresponding change and transformation in oneself. And that cannot happen if there isn't self-reflection, right? If there isn't a depth of sustained reflection And mindfulness then would fall under that category, right? Forms of reflection and transformation. And so to the original question, does mindfulness have a place in the kinds of conversation we're having today? I think it definitely can, right? It definitely can. And there's a lineage of people who, in the US context, who've done that historically.
That's fascinating. Great. I think, as we start to move towards a transition to have Q&A, I wonder, what advice do you have for students? I see a lot of students in the audience. I see a lot of other folks in there, but students, we're here on a campus. What advice do you have for students who want to stay mentally healthy and potentially engage in mindfulness? Where do they start? How do they persist? Things to consider?
I've been tagged. So to stay mentally healthy,
I mean, that's like
I
a
always
very
start-
broad
It
term
is.
to begin with.
so I always start with just it always sounds too simplistic, but twofold. One, just to acknowledge that the mental health conversation is a difficult conversation.
Yes.
So again, sometimes we pretend that it isn't and then we don't engage in it, but it is just a difficult conversation. I mean, just statistically speaking, 1 in 5 people in the US over 12 is living with a mental illness. So I always say it very concretely like that. If we just think about how many of us are in this room, that means some of us are living with mental illness. That doesn't mean that that's something that we have to be ashamed about or that we're stuck in a certain type of way, but we have to be able to acknowledge that and to say these are difficult things sometimes to be able to move through. And in the same way we talked about avoiding avoidance, to be able to move forward in that together, I'd say would be the first part. But then the second would be just to have our minds open to many different ways that we can address our mental health and also our emotional wellness. I think about that from my perspective as someone who identifies as a Christian, being able to think about some of these practices through reading things in Scripture, the ways that God's already talked about us and how that can actually change our mindset as well. But then also not being dismissive of other ways to do that as well. And then to add a third, I would also say that sometimes we too easily equate mental health challenges with a lack of health. And so I often say that you can be living with mental illness and have good mental wellness.
Yeah.
So let's say I'm someone who is navigating through a severe depression. I've learned certain tools and practices to actually help navigate through that. Doesn't mean that things will always be perfect,
Right.
but I can still have good mental wellness. I might be someone who's not living with a mental illness, but I have really bad mental wellness. Like if I sleep 2 hours a night, most people are not going to want to be around me and would probably tell me, something seems a little bit off. You may need to change your practices. And so I think it's good to hold both of those together and to realize that either living with mental illness or not, or living without mental illness doesn't mean that we have good mental wellness or not by default. And so we have to actively engage in practices and conversations and just to be honest about the things that we can address together as community.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think my advice to students would be the same advice that I give myself and the same advice that I would give anyone, which is to be fundamentally curious, right? To have the spirit to keep searching for better and better answers, right? And that can mean searching across cultures, that can mean searching across studies, that could mean, right? I think especially for students in a research university, right, who are perfectly poised to do research, right? You can do that same research on yourself, on your family, on your community. You can become fundamentally curious about what it means to you to be healthy, right? What that has meant to others historically, what that means currently for others in other cultures and communities. I think to not do that and to not be interested in doing that is a genuine disservice to oneself. That is my direct experience. And in fact, my learning about figures like Howard Thurman and Rosemary Freeman Harding and all of these kinds of people came out of a curiosity about the role of mental health and health writ large in activist communities, right? Which then led to me to look at figures who have talked about this
Right.
and the things that they have said about them. Be curious.
Always be curious. I love the approach that, I think from our conversation, hearing that there are so many different ways that you can approach and incorporate and re-examine and consider the role of mindfulness when it relates to your mental health, and that it doesn't have to be, it's never one size fits all, right? Like that's a great takeaway, and continuing to be curious and find those new pathways, build those new pathways for yourself is incredibly important. So I want to transition to our lovely audience and invite some questions and responses. We'll have about 20 minutes for questions for our panelists. All right, let's start here.
My name is Jody Moore. I'm a 27. Thank you both for being here. So one of the slider questions is, what role can religious communities play in communal mental health challenges?
So what role can religious communities play in mental health challenges?
Correct.
Great. I'll just repeat the questions to make sure that everybody can hear it.
Well, you brought up one example earlier. Yeah.
So my knee-jerk, honest reaction, this isn't the way the question was written, but when I hear it, it often makes me think that faith communities can play a good role or a bad role. And I alluded to that in that scenario I painted for you earlier as well. And so I think in a lot of ways, and this gets back to one of the themes I already mentioned, just the importance of community. It's important to be able to address these things in community where people actually are able to listen. So I think for some of us, again, speaking from a Christian perspective, we know certain things that we are called to do through reading of the Bible. So one of the passages I often talk about is in the book of Philippians, where it says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, bring your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. So a very powerful scripture that can really meet us during times of anxious thoughts. But the reason I also bring that up is because sometimes it's easy for people to take that scripture and basically diminish someone for having a period of challenges or anxiety without actually listening to what that person is going through. And so I think, again, getting back to the question, we can help each other out if we can point each other towards these truths that we have in our scriptures to help people without diminishing what people are going through, and to know that there are challenges that come up along the way. And one of the jokes I often mention is that we often don't really know how to listen, because especially when it comes to mental health, I mentioned it's a difficult topic. If someone's having a mental health challenge, and if we care about them, we're likely going to have an urge to try and fix their quote unquote problem. So someone will start sharing with us and will immediately say, you got to do this, 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 and this, and this. But if we're listening, we shouldn't be talking. Like we actually just have to stop talking and force ourselves to hear what the other person is sharing with us, to understand where they're coming from, which isn't easy to do.
Right.
And then also maybe give the advice or provide resources, or maybe not provide resources at that time and just say, I'm here for you. I'm here walking through this with you. And so I think it can go both ways. I think it's a really important question.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it highlights the fact that one does not have to go it alone, right? Go at it alone. With the caveat, as Professor Addy just said, that religious communities can help and they can hurt. But knowing that fact, right, that is not unlike any other institution that we can name. And so knowing that you can amplify the help and you can transform the hurt. And not to invoke, the queen, Maya Angelou, right? You do the best you can, and then when you know better, you do better, right? And that communities are not exempt from that. They can and must be made better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Thanks so much for this wonderful panel. I wanted to ask about this concept that's often brought up in probably both mindfulness and mental health circles, sort of non-judgment. So I'm thinking particularly of the definition Professor Craig gave of sort of attunement and remembering, or metacognition. And that could become its own problem, right? If we're given an instruction, be aware of your thoughts, and we're having like anxious racing thoughts, and then we remember them and we attune to them. That is maybe not such a helpful thing. We hear a lot of mindfulness practices. Be aware, but sort of non-judgmental. Just let it be. Sort of spoke to this. So I'd be curious, to hear you both speak to when we're talking about mindfulness, mental health, metacognition, what is the role of where's judgment, just being with things and not sort of hyper, like how could it also be turning into this hyper fixation
Yeah.
issue when we are spending maybe too much time
Yeah.
being too selfish?
Well, thank you for that, Professor Weiner. Professor Weiner is also a great scholar of religion in his own right. That is an important question because judgment is not a bad thing, right? According for most of the religious traditions that I've studied, right, judgment has a very specific role, right? There are wholesome ways of thinking and there are unwholesome ways of thinking. There are wholesome practices to engage in, there are unwholesome practices to engage in. And so mindfulness, for example, or right, practices that coalesce around these terms like mindfulness, is not to allow the mind, for example, to race, right, uncontrollably. It is to be very attentive. That's the other piece, the monitoring piece that I mentioned, right? It's to be very attentive to what is racing to, and to learn how to put a stop to the unwholesome things that race through. Now, that is something that is very difficult to do on one's own. And this is where the role, back to the question that was asked earlier, right? This becomes the role of community, of teachers, right? Of having specialists who know, right? And can say, not so much that way, right? More this way, et cetera. So that is then the role of community, of expertise, and also of judgment, right? There is a common misperception in the appropriation of these traditions out of Asia, that these traditions say it's all good. Like, oh, just sit down and breathe. I'm like, yeah, maybe your knees might fall over something, but it's okay, because it's all good. That is not what any of these traditions say, right? It is, in fact, they say it is not all good. Right? And that there is a way.
Pay attention.
Yeah. So that's what I would say to that. And I wonder, actually, in what you were talking about earlier about metacognition, which is to show up in all my classes, not all about it. Where in the practice of metacognition for you, where does, as Professor Weiner was saying, right, where does the buck stop? Right? Do you get into cycles where you're just kind of going on and on in a direction that may not be helpful?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question. I thought your answer was it was the perfect answer to the question. And I think, again, before I get to that, I think the community piece is so important. And I think you're also alluding to that community can come from different places.
Yeah.
So even as you were talking, I'm thinking about a therapist who's sitting with someone and helping them challenge those thoughts to realize, okay, me ruminating over this idea over and over is actually not healthy, and the idea is actually false and leading me to believe something that's not. So I think that also gets your point. It can come from others in the faith community. It can come from people who are just sitting down together. I have a close friend who grew up in India, is now here in the States, but has been doing a lot of initiatives across the country in India with youth, millions of youth, just train them how to listen to each other and how that's having so many impacts on mental health for young people. Just being able, again, to listen without speaking and hear what people are saying. So I would say it's a really important point. I think for me, it becomes, again, having those aspects of community, but also learning what other people have said to me and paying attention to myself to figure out when is that healthy and when is it not healthy. So one of the things I've noticed about myself is I have a really good memory for some things. And I think it's because I rehearse things quite a bit. And that can be good if it's something that was really positive and something I enjoyed, but it can be detrimental if it's something that I really don't need to be rehearsing. So part of it is having some discernment to know when is it good to keep that metacognition and to move through, and when do I need to actually verbalize it to someone else to help me pull back and shift to something else. So it's a very dynamic process, not one that has a prescripted answer each time, but something I also have to be aware about as well.
I love that, the dynamism. That's so key.
Great. Others? Yes.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I'm curious, whether you are speaking from a place of, as members of multiple communities, right? You're both scholars and you both come from particular communities of faith. I'm curious how you think about bringing terms, ideas, concepts, as y'all both have done, from those communities to a place like Dartmouth or any of the places we're in today that are like diverse and people from multiple communities? Do you think that, like on a question like mental health, for example, where people of all kinds of different backgrounds struggle with it, is there, like, what are the sort of boundaries on bringing particular ideas from particular traditions? How can you communicate those ideas across divides? Like Professor Craig, you were just mentioning this idea of mindfulness kind of gets ripped from its roots in some ways. How do you navigate those choices effectively? Because I think we would hope that there is some ability for these traditions to talk to each other, but that can go wrong in so many ways. I'm just curious how you both sort of process that.
Yeah.
I'm glad you bring that up. I mean, I would never, to the point you made earlier, I would never be listening to someone tell me some set of things about their anxieties or their mental health or whatever, and say to them, you really should meditate. I highly recommend. Right? I wouldn't say that in this context forever, because there's so much that I would by definition not know. So it would require more dialogue, right? And I'm glad you brought up, and I touched on this earlier, right? This kind of repeated appropriation, right? So for example, if in a classroom, right, I think about the number of times I've been asked, would I teach like meditation or some form of mindfulness in a class? That may be on a completely separate topic, right? But if I were to say yes, and what we'll do is the Islamic call to prayer. Or I say, yes, and as our practice for today, we will say the Lord's Prayer as our mindfulness practice. I think immediately there would be a range of responses, right? From no to, wait, how's that mindfulness? And all of the above, right? And this is largely because of the way Buddhism, in particular, and Asian religious traditions more broadly, are seen to be often not even real religions, right? They are these kinds of excerptable sites of philosophy and practice that you can just take out and apply somewhere else, right? And so to then tell someone, not knowing much about them, right, to then recommend to them some set of practices that may or may not be appropriate would not be a good idea. At the same time, we should also have to be careful of primitivizing these traditions as if they were not present, relevant traditions that also have things to say about health, about well-being, about mental health, and so on and so forth, right? So then the role of dialogue, right, to be very clear about what we're dialoguing about becomes very important in that kind of time.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree. I think for me, one thing I've also tried to add on as well, which comes from dialogue, but just creating a sense of authenticity in the conversations, and as much as is possible, even a sense of trust. So we talked about a little bit about your book, creating brave spaces and not safe spaces, but I think that is part of it as well. Like, how much can we actually come into a room and not just say, well, I'm here to tell you everything I know.
Yeah.
I mean, I even do that. So a few years ago, I was actually doing an event at a library. So it wasn't something I had a choice to do. My wife had started this thing called the STEM Coffee Hour, and she wanted a topic on mental health and addiction. So
there you go.
When I was asked, I only had one response I was able to give. But it was a really fruitful conversation. So the church I was involved in at the time also had an outreach where they had people who were recovering from addiction who were living in a house together. So all those individuals came to that event. And I intentionally tried not to have a time where I was just giving didactic information. Like, I wanted it to be a dialogue, even though I was providing information for the people in the room. So I talked about the neuroscience of addiction, what happens in the brain. A lot of the people came into that session saying, oh, I don't see this as an illness because this is something I did to myself, which on one hand is true. You can't become addicted to a substance if you never used in the first place. But at the end of the event, they said, okay, now I have a better understanding about how using this substance has changed my brain, and how that doesn't mean that's the end of the story, but there are things I can do to move forward. So just getting back to that concept of having a dialogue with everyone in the room having them share their stories about, I tried this medicated assisted treatment. It made me feel horrible. And me listening to that as a neuroscientist and not just saying, well, the way that acts in the brain is it does this, and this, so you should do this, like that just is not helpful. So even though we are in all these places with people coming from different traditions or different backgrounds or different experiences, to be able to create that space of dialogue, I think helps us all learn from each other without having to diminish our convictions. So I wouldn't say something that is contradictory to my faith as a Christian, but I would still share from my experience with the same mindset of also hearing from other people's experiences as well. And I would say it takes, as you can probably hear my answer, it takes a lot of work to get to that place.
Yes.
It's not something that is done easily, but it's definitely worthwhile.
Great. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm a recently retired hospice palliative care physician. So I'm curious how both mindfulness, but especially curious about the Buddhist tradition, how you come alongside someone facing the end of their life and how much stress that puts not just on them, but on their family and their friends, their homes, their support. Because there's lots of mental health issues that arise in this scenario.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the question was, can you just focus the question?
I'm curious how mindfulness in general sense, but especially curious about the Buddhist tradition. I'm understanding that Buddhist tradition doesn't teach that you can self.
Oh, okay.
And so there's no afterlife, and someone's facing, this is it. I can't use mindfulness to work my way through this. There is no through. How do you come alongside folks facing it?
Yeah.
Well, in Buddhism, of course, in Buddhist traditions and the traditional studies, right, there is a defined conception of the afterlife and what occurs for an individual after this life. And there are notions in Buddhist traditions about good death, right, how to approach the end. And I want to lift up the work of a place in Santa Fe, New Mexico, called the Upaya Zen Center, which I'm not affiliated with that community. I don't practice with them, but I know some of those people, and they pioneered something called the Being with Dying program, which is to address exactly this question in Buddhist tradition. The name of the Roshi who founded it is escaping me. Joan Halifax, yeah. Roshi Joan Halifax, right? So she is a Zen priest. So yeah, there are defined ways of dealing with the end of life in Buddhist traditions. And the fact that they're then in those contexts, that there is no self, doesn't mean nothing goes on, right? For Buddhist traditions, this means that the collection of parts that make up the person, right, that those parts do continue on in a different fashion, right? And these are all held together by the idea of cause and effect, right? So that's often how a person will be counseled. But not, and I want to be very clear about this, not blame, right? Cause and effect, but not blame, right? So to say in the example I gave earlier, that about the homework thing, you get to the end of the quarter, it's like, oh, right, that is not to say that you are to be blamed because it's not week 8 and you write that paper and you were foolish and right? That is not, no one may feel that way, right? That's generally not going to help you get that thing done. It might, I mean, it might, sometimes a little pressure might help. But it is to say that this came to be from a specific set of causes, and you can determine what those causes are. Now, Buddhists, for example, would apply that same understanding to the end of life and the next life, that there are a set of causes that one can do towards the end that will help in how one experiences the end. And I will say that for myself, now speaking as a practitioner, not as a scholar, although the two are inevitably connected, as a practitioner, I would say that we have many beliefs about the end and what is next. We do not have knowledge, right? That is a frontier that is fundamentally a mystery, but tied to the way one understands karma and cause and effect writ large. Right?